Hello, welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Trauma and Literature. We just finished with Virginia Woolf's novel Mrs. Dalloway, and we'll start with a new text today, as mentioned in the last lecture. So this particular book, which we'll cover today, is a theoretical book. It's a book of philosophy, actually, on trauma. It's by a philosopher called Catherine Malabou, and we'll talk in some details in terms of how some of the theoretical components she talks about can be connected and mapped onto a course like this. So the name of the book is The New Wounded by Catherine Malabou. It's a French book. It's been translated into English, and we'll use a PDF, which is a translation of the original book. Now, as I mentioned, this is it's a very big philosophical book, so obviously we'll have to read it selectively. We'll select certain passages which we'll pay some attention to in details, and we'll also connect that to some of the things which we have talked about already, especially in relation to Mrs. Dalloway. Because if you remember Mrs. Dalloway, we mentioned PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, which is essentially something which happens to soldiers and also to civilians as well. And we saw how in that novel by Woolf, Septimus Smith is a protagonist who suffers from PTSD, traumatized subject. But then the irony and the tragedy of his is, no one seems to understand him. The medical discourse around him, the contemporary medical discourse around him has no idea, no knowledge in terms of how to cure him. And they resort to the older methods of coercion and confinement, which makes it worse for him. And at the end of the novel, we see him committing suicide by jumping from a window. So that, obviously becomes a very, very tragic human scene. And we see how the medical and existential and the political, they meet together in Mrs. Dalloway. And we have the biomedical regime sort of trying to confine the man, trying to confine and control the human subject. And the entire novel can be seen as a novel about helpless resistance against that kind of biomedical coercion. Now, what we see in this book of philosophy by Catherine Malabou, which is The New Wounded, the name of the book, we find that how she defines certain terms which are very useful in terms of locating the traumatized subject, in terms of looking at the entire ontology of the wound. And the reason why she calls it a new wounded is because she offers a new definition of mental wound. She offers a new definition of mental trauma or mental injury, right? So, which is a bit of a post-Freudian way, a post-Lacanian, a post-Freudian way to look at trauma and injury, mental injury. Now, before we begin with the text per se, Malabou's location needs to be just highlighted a little bit before we can connect to this particular text. So Malabou is a very interesting philosopher, as I mentioned, because she is someone who seems to connect post-structuralism with trauma theory. So we have a very interesting take on trauma. As I mentioned, this is a very post-classical, post-Freudian take on trauma, and she offers a more distributive, post-structuralist understanding of trauma. So you find that in this particular book, and also elsewhere at Malabou, there's a lot of emphasis done on plasticity, and she talks about different kinds of plasticity in terms of how that connects to mental states of the subjects. So plasticity as a destructive plasticity, plasticity as a reconstructive phenomenon. So there's a very neural component about plasticity, as we all know. And she will mention several neuroscientists during her thesis, where she talks about someone like Joseph Ledoux, for example, who talks about synaptic plasticity, how the neural system in our brain, in our entire system, is very plastic in quality. That plasticity makes us creative, makes us regenerative, makes us resistant to injury, etc. So plasticity is a very important phenomenon neurally and medically speaking. Now, what Malabou does, interestingly, is she takes this medical theory of plasticity and extends it into more philosophical post-structuralist understanding of that condition, in terms of how that becomes a marker of the human condition, a human existential condition. And it is precisely this bridge between the medical and existential and the political, which makes Malabou a very, very significant philosopher for us today, especially in a course like this, Trauma and Literature. Because, as I just mentioned, if you look at Mrs. Dalloway, the Woolf novel, you find that it's not just a medical novel. It's not just about a person who is mistreated medically. It's also about how that mistreatment, how that mishandling of the situation becomes or extends into an existential crisis of sorts, and how that aggravates the condition of the human subject. So this bridge between the medical, existential, and political is very, very important. And Malabou, as a philosopher, offers that connection very robustly in a very creative and innovative way. So her notion of plasticity, her notion of the wound, the reontologization of the wound per se, is something which needs to be taken very seriously, especially in a course like this. So this page, which should be on your screen, this is page 17, the PDF that I'm using, which should be on your screen. She talks about new wounded. So what is the definition of new wounded? So that's the title of the book, as I mentioned. And this is what she says. This is the second paragraph on your screen of page 17, 1-7. The new wounded, the people with brain lesions, have replaced the possessed or the madmen of ancient medicine and the neurotics of psychoanalysis. The spectre of such phenomena hints at the scope of a post-traumatic condition that reigns everywhere today and demands to be taught. So as we can see how she is historicizing this project, so how she said that, in ancient medieval times, people with head injury, people with trauma, people with mental injury were considered to be possessed. And there was different kinds of treatment given to those people. Some of them included physical coercion. Some of them included physical torture of sorts. So being possessed, and then that was redefined as madmen in ancient medicine. So, madmen, as you can see, if you read Foucault, for example, madness was very quickly connected to power, and how the entire idea of controlling the madman became a project of power. And then later on, psychoanalysis redefined that as neurotics, right? So, in Freud, for example, he has two kinds of definitions of head injury, neurotic and psychotic, right? So Freud's idea of trauma is something which Malabou mentions and draws on. At the same time, she deconstructs it in a very literal Derridian way. And that's why I mentioned that she is a very interesting bridge between Derridian post-structuralism and Freudian psychoanalysis, in a way that she deconstructs psychoanalysis. And she says that, what was considered to be madmen or, possessed or neurotics are now to be sent as new wounded. So the new definition of wounded or head injury or brain injury or mental wound is something which she offers over here in a philosophical framework. And she talks about the spectre, which again is a very Derridian metaphor, as some of you would know. This entire idea, the spectrality that Derrida talks about, the spectre of such phenomena hints at the scope of the post-traumatic condition that reigns everywhere today and demands to be taught. So the spectrality of that wounded condition is something that she sort of takes very seriously. And the idea of spectrality obviously brings in Derrida in a very direct way, because Derrida, as you know, he talks about spectrality a lot. So a large part of Derridian deconstruction is about spectrality, and he has a book called Spectres of Marx, etc. So we can see how Malabou's vocabulary is very, very post-structuralist, very, very Derridian in a very direct way. Okay, now this is a section in the book where she talks about plasticity, and she defines 3 different kinds of plasticity. And again, this should be on the screen on the same page, page 17. And the title of the section is Plasticity and Destruction. These remarks bring me to my third main idea, the apparition of a new phase of plasticity. To recognize the determining causal value of the wound is to take into account its plastic power upon the psyche. The term plasticity, one should recall, has 3 principal significations. On one hand, it designates the capacity of certain materials, such as clay or plaster, to receive form. On the other hand, it designates the power to give form, the power of a sculptor or a plastic surgeon. But finally, it also refers to the possibility of a deflagration or explosion of every form, as when one speaks about plastique or plastic explosive, or in the French, plastic egg, which simply means bombing. The notion of plasticity is thus situated at both extremes of the creation and destruction of form. Now, this is very, very Derridian and very post-structuralist, because she's offering a very ambivalent idea of plasticity. Plasticity is something which can be sculpted, can be created as a constructive, generative quality. Plasticity is something which talks about, the capacity to receive form, so the reception to creativity, the reception to generation or generative ability. And the third bit is about destruction, is about explosion, the explosive quality, the potentially explosive quality of plasticity. And what she does in the process is she locates the notion of plasticity as situated somewhere between the extremes of creation and destruction of form. Now, as we can see, this is a very philosophical framework. The notion of plasticity, the concept of plasticity, the ontology of plasticity. Now, what she does essentially is she takes this philosophical framework, and then she sort of tries to locate it or map it onto brain injury or head injury. And she tries to connect this philosophy of plasticity with the neural understanding of cognition, the neuroscientific understanding of cognition through neurons. So she talks about synaptic plasticity, and she mentions Joseph Ledoux over and over again. Ledoux is a very important neuroscientist. For those of us interested in literature and neuroscience and philosophy and neuroscience, phenomenology and neuroscience, Ledoux is a very important figure because he talks about the idea of plasticity from a neuroscientific perspective. So there's a wonderful book called A Synaptic Self, where he talks about plasticity as a very key component of cognition. Now, the reason why Ledoux is important for Malabou is Malabou draws in Ledoux's philosophy of plasticity or medical theory of plasticity and gives it a philosophical framework in order to understand cognition and also the subject position, which is very, very important. Okay, which of these three senses should one retain to characterize the plastic power of the wound upon the psyche? So she talks about, as we can see, she talks about trauma as a reformation of the psyche. So whenever a traumatic experience happens, the psyche of the subject is reformed, deformed as well as reformed. So trauma as something which essentially changes the structure of the subject, right? So that's a very definition of trauma. Something which changes the structure of the subject, the ontology of the subject. So the human subject is reontologized in a certain sense, post-trauma, right? So, and she's talking about how the idea of plasticity can be seen as something which is a wound upon the psyche. Certainly, this power is a power to create form in the sense that it brings upon a metamorphosis of identity. So again, the word metamorphosis is very, very important. Metamorphosis means an essential change, a complete change. A different ontology is formed, metamorphosis, right? So there's a certain Kafkaesque quality about the word as well. A man becoming a spider, for example, if you read the Kafka novel, right? So the metamorphosis of identity. So as you can see, the vocabulary is so philosophical: identity, spectre. She talks about plasticity as a double metaphor as well, a medical metaphor as well as a philosophical metaphor. So there's constant connection between philosophy and medical science is something which makes Malabou a very, very robust and interesting figure for us today, especially in a course like this, Trauma and Literature. So you can see the vocabulary is constantly straddling the medical and the philosophical realms. Metamorphosis of identity, spectre, right? So all these are very Derridian things. And this identity is itself plastic to the extent that it is susceptible to being imprinted by this new form. So the very notion of identity is a performative plastic thing. So again, look at the post-structuralist understanding of the subject. The subject is always changing. The being, as we know, is always changing. And when a trauma happens to the being, it completely changes the subject. It completely makes the subject a different kind of subject in a very literal medical way, because the neural framing, the neural structure in the head changes. So you essentially become a different person post-trauma, right? So, trauma has a potential to sort of reform the subject, and sometimes destructively or sometimes in a more creative way. We'll talk about how this constant shift between destruction and creation is something which defines plasticity as Malabou studies it. Nonetheless, it is clear that wounds, traumas, or catastrophes are not creators of form in a positive sense of the term. We're quite far from the sculptural paradigm of beautiful form. If the wound, as a determining cause of the transformation of the psyche, has a plastic power, it can only be understood in terms of the third sense of plasticity: explosion and annihilation. If brain damage creates a new identity, this creation can be only creation through a destruction of form. The plasticity at stake here is thus destructive plasticity, right? So at the outset, she defines three kinds of plasticity: generative, receptive, and destructive. The three different kinds of plasticity: something which can create a new form, something which is receptive to a new form, and a third bit is something which explodes into a new form. And she says that in the case of trauma, the third definition of plasticity is the most commonplace definition, is a destruction of form, right? So it's not really a creation or a sculpting of a new subject. It's a destruction of a subject, and in the process, it creates a new subject, not in a creative way, not in a beautiful way, but in a destructive way. So she's talking about destructive plasticity over here, destruction of form. That is the defining quality of the plasticity associated with trauma and head injury. Such plasticity, and herein resides its paradox, ultimately remains an adventure of form. It's a very interesting definition, an adventure of form. Okay? Okay, this is page 17 again. Towards the end, it ultimately remains an adventure of form. And what patients with Alzheimer's disease show us, to take this example once again, is precisely, this is page 18, the plasticity of the wound through which the permanent dislocation of one identity forms another identity. An identity that's neither the sublation or nor the compensatory replica of the old form, but rather literally a form of destruction. Such patients prove that destruction is a form that forms. The destruction might indeed constitute a form of psychic life. The formative destructive power of the wound, as we're attempting to think of it now, may thus be articulated in this way. All suffering is formative in the identity that endures it. So, if you take a look at this paragraph at the beginning of page 18, it's a profoundly philosophical paragraph, but then it talks about Alzheimer's disease, which is a real medical disease. So again, look at the connection between the medical and the philosophical that Malabou is offering constantly. And she talks about how plasticity in a destructive sense or explosive sense is rampant, is spectacularly visible in the case of Alzheimer's disease, the people, the patients become a different subject altogether because of memory loss that happens due to that tragic condition. So it becomes literally a form of destruction. It's not really a sublation or a compensation from the old form, but a destruction of the old form altogether. Such patients prove that destruction is a form that forms. So destruction becomes a form in a certain sense, and that form becomes another form, a new form, a destructive form. The destruction might indeed constitute a form of psychic life. So this is a paradox that Malabou is trying to highlight. The destruction also offers a new form of psychic life. It's a tragic destruction. It destroys the subject's continuity in terms of history and memory, but then that destruction also offers a new form of psychic life, a new structure of psychic life in a certain sense. The formative destructive power of the wound, as we are attempting to think of it now, may thus be articulated in this way. All suffering is formative of the identity that endures it. It's actually a very simple thing. It says that suffering, the identity that is enduring the suffering, is being formed through the process of suffering, right? So the suffering, the experience of suffering, forms a new structure which endures the suffering. So as we can see, there's a spatio-temporal quality about plasticity over here. So when trauma happens, when a head injury happens, when Alzheimer's happens, it changes the subject. And the change in the subject is the same subject which is enduring the trauma, right? So the same subject which is changed by the trauma is the one which endures the trauma, right? So all suffering is formative of the identity that endures it. So the identity which endures the suffering is caused by the suffering. So there's a performative quality about plasticity at play over here. In other words, the damage done to the human subject and the new subject which comes out of the damage is the subject which endures the entire suffering. So again, we're looking at a process of destruction / construction, not in a positive sense, but in a tragic medical sense. So the old subject is destroyed. There's a new subject which is made due to the suffering, and the same subject which is made due to the suffering is what endures the suffering, right? So the process of enduring the suffering, enduring the trauma, is done by the trauma itself in a certain sense. So old suffering is formative. It forms the identity which endures the suffering, right? So the question of enduring becomes interesting over here. How then does the theme of destructive plasticity orient the critical confrontation between psychoanalysis and neurology that I'm now undertaking? So again, this is a connection that she's making, psychoanalysis and neurology. To begin with, it must be acknowledged that neither Freud nor the neurologists have elaborated the concept. And psychoanalysis and neurology, plasticity is a powerful operative category, but it is only ever understood in terms of its first two senses, reception and donation of form. So it's a third form that Malabou is more interested in. And as I mentioned at the beginning, she's offering three different versions of plasticity. And she says that, in classic psychoanalysis, plasticity is always seen as a formative pattern or a receptive pattern, something which forms the subject or something which receives the new potential, right? But the destructive plasticity is something which hardly comes up in Freud. The third sense, that of deflagration, is ignored. A neurological reflection upon the determining power of the mind or the wound and trauma is certainly a reflection upon the change in identity that destroys the same identity. But this reflection lacks a concept that would make it possible to define the meaning of this change and to grasp the psyche in terms of its capacity to survive after the wound not as an absence of form, but as a form of its absence. If the category of plasticity does play a role in both psychoanalysis and neurology, it gives no more than a hint of its own negativity. Now, this is interesting because what she says over here is actually quite philosophical. She says, and if we take a look at the section, so plasticity is not the absence of form. There can be no such thing as formlessness. Rather, plasticity becomes a form of the absence. If you replace the word absence with trauma, right? It's not the trauma of form, but the form of trauma. In order to understand the trauma, you have to understand the pattern of trauma. In other words, trauma causes a new pattern, and that same new pattern helps the subject endure the trauma, which is what you said just a while ago. So it's not really an absence of form, but a form of its absence. So it should be studied not just as a pure negativity, but something which is potentially, not productive, but it gives a structure to a certain sense. In other words, a complete structurelessness is impossible. So every trauma creates its own kind of structure, and the same structure helps the subject sustain the trauma in a certain sense. So it's a form of its absence. So, the absence, if we replace the word absence of trauma, plasticity in this particular case, destructive plasticity, becomes the form of the trauma. In order to understand the trauma, that is the pattern that plasticity is offering. Okay, and I will skip a little bit. Okay, we come to a section which should be on the screen. It's called cerebral auto-affection, right? And this is actually, it talks about the idea of the auto-subject, right? And that's what Malabou talks about as well. The whole idea of the Freudian drive and how this the subject becomes from the drive, or comes from the particular drive. Okay, so page 32 is what you're looking at, and a section that we're looking at specifically is called the brain as an electrical system, right? So it's obviously very provocatively titled, but it is exactly what Malabou wants to do, talk about how the brain becomes a system of electrochemical reactions. What does this mean? Freud never contested the pertinence of the metaphor of the brain as an electrical system that Breuer developed in Studies on Hysteria. And then there's a definition of Breuer, in his contribution to his work, Breuer describes his brain as a pure and simple medium for the transmission of energy. And this is a quotation from Breuer, which says, "We ought not to think of a cerebral part of conduction as resembling a telephone wire, which is only excited electrically at the moment at which it has a function. We ought to liken it to a telephone line through which there's a constant flow of galvanic current, which can no longer be excited if that current ceases. Or better, let us imagine a widely ramified electrical system for lighting and the transmission of motor power. What is expected of the system excuse me, is that simple establishment of a contact shall be able to set any lamp or machine in operation. To make this possible, so everything shall be ready to work, there must be a certain tension present throughout the entire network of lines of conduction, and the dynamo engine must expand a given quantity of energy for this purpose. It is the same way, a certain amount of excitation present in the conductive parts of the brain when it is at rest but awake and prepared to work. So look at the way in which Breuer is offering a series of metaphors: telephone line, electrical wires, etc. In other words, the brain is seen as an excited electrical machine through which different transmissions have taken place, right? And this is what Malabou is drawing on as well. And this is what she says in the section here. I'm just highlighting it. The brain. The brain, therefore, can only confront its own energetic excess through dysfunction. It is not equipped with any structure that would make it possible to dilute excesses by detouring, which is to say, differentiating this energy. In other terms, it cannot rely upon any apparatus of representation. In other words, the whole idea of energetic excess becomes a problem for the brain, and any energetic excess will lead the brain to dysfunctionality. So trauma, in a certain sense, could be seen as a sudden explosion of energy in the brain, which makes the brain dysfunctional to a certain extent. And as Malabou goes on to say, it is not equipped with any structure that will make it possible to dilute the excess by detouring. The brain cannot detour the excess energy through a different channel altogether. It cannot differentiate, it cannot detour this energy. In other terms, it cannot rely upon any apparatus of representation. So in other words, the brain cannot represent it outside. So you can replace the word representation with, let us say, outsourcing. The brain cannot outsource its excitement through a different channel the brain has to conduct it through the particular network. So any explosion of energy, any energetic excess will lead the brain to dysfunctionality. It will just become dysfunctional as the way it conducts itself in terms of its energy. Okay, right. Next we come to the idea of emotions. And how does Malabou talk about emotion? This is page 37, which should be on the screen. And the section is titled A Neurobiological Theory of Emotions, Homeostasis and Effect, right? So homeostasis is balance and effect. And how do emotions come into being? So, how do you locate emotions and the entire idea of plasticity and the subject position? Emotions seem to be a much older word than drive. In fact, emotion is not really a concept, but rather a synthesis word that ultimately designates something that neither classical psychoanalysis nor neurology were capable of thinking. A dynamic, since emotion, we hear movement of the relation between the brain and the body, the very movement of the psychosomatic totality made up of a singular body and the nervous system. So, what Malabou defines right away at this section is the kinetic quality of an emotion. Our emotions are mutable, kinetic, always changing from one subject position to another subject position, and at the same time determining subject position. In other words, the subject produces emotions. At the same time, the subject is produced by emotions. So there's a two-way, bi-directional process about emotions. So it's a movement between the brain and the body, and then the entire movement of the psychosomatic totality. So the brain and the body merge together through emotions. So emotional equilibrium determines the balance of the brain and the body, and is made up of a singular body and a nervous system. There is a constant exchange of information between the two. So the brain and the nervous system and the body, they are in a dialogue in terms of information exchange in the nervous system. Life regulates itself by informing itself about itself. And the self-information constitutes the elementary form of cerebral activity. So this is the meaning of auto-affection. Life regulates itself by informing itself about itself. So there's a metacognitive quality about life. So, the brain is informing itself of its own information. And this self-information constitutes the elementary form of cerebral activity. So the brain must have knowledge of its own self. The brain must be aware of itself through a knowledge that it sends to itself. And this cerebral activity, which is formed by this auto-knowledge, is the first fundamental step in embodiment and the idea of personality, etc. We must be aware of ourselves as a brain, right? And this awareness is the first step towards cerebral activity. The origin of the dynamics of emotion lies precisely in this elementary activity. To begin with, emotion does not designate such and such an effect or passion, but rather a process at work in the regulation of life. There is a pure vital emotion without any object rather than the self, the cerebral self. So, emotions, as is mentioned, determine the self. The self produces emotion, and the self is also produced by emotions. It's a bidirectional process, as I mentioned, and it's constantly this constant kinetic quality about emotions, this constant mutable quality about emotions is what makes the entire idea of self so performative in quality, so post-structuralist in quality. So again, if you look at the vocabulary of Malabou, she's obviously talking about very medical terms, emotion as a medical term, and a drive as a medical term. But the vocabulary that she's using is a very philosophical vocabulary. The framework is very philosophical. And this philosophical post-structuralist framework is very, very important for us to underscore, because as I mentioned, one thing we should continue to do when we read Malabou is to keep locating her as a connect between neuroscience and philosophy, as she's one of the very rare philosophers who make that connect so seamlessly and so elegantly. So, preoccupied with the logic of the drive, psychoanalysis failed to notice the process at work within the homeostatic functioning of the nervous system itself, whereby the regulation of life gives rise to effects. Far from being a mechanical process comparable to the functioning of a generator, homeostasis is an affective economy, and this is a very, very interesting term. And I will stop here today as well. The affective economy. In other words, one of the criticisms that she has against Freudian psychoanalysis is the idea that it relies too much on drive, sexual drive, hunger drive, libidinal drive, etc., and gives too little importance to emotions. Emotions being the process through which drives are formed. So emotions are the fundamental process through which the self is aware of itself. As just Malabou mentioned, the self must inform itself. The self must auto-inform itself. And this auto-information is a process of immersion in a certain sense, right? So, the process at work within a homeostatic functioning of the nervous system is life giving rise to efforts, right? And far from being a mechanical process compatible to a generator, homeostasis as an affective economy. So affective economy is an emotional economy. It's not really a stable a mechanical process, but an affective kinetic process through emotions. So the entire idea of homeostasis, the balance of emotions, the balance of the self, homeostasis, that one functioning self, the one moving self, which is formed through emotion, it is an affective process. So in other words, what Malabou is saying essentially is that we are an emotional system. We are an emotional brain. And again, Joseph Ledoux, L-E-D-O-U-X, Joseph Ledoux has a magnificent book called Emotional Brain, and he talks about how the brain is an emotional machine, which is exactly what Malabou is talking about over here. And so looking at the brain as a drive-based machine, hunger drive, sexual drive, etc., we need to pay more attention to emotions, because emotions form the processes through which drives come, emerge at the end. So that's the more fundamental thing about a human self, the emotional self. And that's why neuroscientists like Ledoux are looking at emotions so carefully. Even someone like Antonio Damasio, who Malabou mentions just here and elsewhere in his book as well. Damasio talks about the cognitive quality of emotions, that we need to be emotional in order to perform cognition. Right? So emotions are a very vital part of cognition. If you're not emotional, then our cognitive abilities are impaired, are affected adversely. So the elementary activity of the nervous system is maintaining excitation at the lowest possible level conducive to survival. That is a homeostatic position, the stable emotional excitation system. Because as I just mentioned, Malabou mentioned just a little while ago, that an explosion of excitement will lead to dysfunctionality, which is what trauma is, an explosion of excitement, right? It is no way the brain can channel it out to some other detour, right? There is no other detour. There's no representation outside the brain. The brain must contain everything within itself, right? So the elementary activity of the nervous system is to maintain excitation at the lowest possible level. That's the desired state to be, to survival. And this process, this activity produces effects. The brain affects itself while regulating life. This is the auto-affection that Malabou talks about. The brain must continue to affect itself emotionally to regulate life. So regulation is a process of controlling, and that process can only operate, can only happen through a controlling of emotions. Accordingly, there is no principle of inertia, the name that Freud gives to the principle of constancy without emotion, that is, without auto-affection of the mechanism producing constancy. So the entire principle of inertia, to remain in a stable, static position, not excitement, no excitement and no overexcitement, that inertia position, which is the desired position, that principle of inertia must be seen, must be sort of studied through auto-affection. We cannot have a concept of the principle of inertia without the concept of emotion, without the concept of auto-affection, or the mechanism producing constancy. So emotions, in a way, and this is in a way, and it's almost like an Aristotelian thing, if you think about it, and the cathartic thing that Aristotle talks about. And when we go to theater, any excess emotion you have is spilled out in the stage. You see a piece of theater, and it produces rage in you, it produces fear in you. In the process, it produces sympathy in you, and all the excess emotions should be leveled out by the end of the play, by the end of the theater, just so when you come out of the theater hall, you come out with a better homeostatic system. I mean, again, you mix in theater with medical science. But there's a similar kind of thing happening in Malabou as well. She talks about how emotions hold the key for the principle of inertia. There should be emotional equilibrium rather than drive equilibrium, right? So all excess emotions must be balanced out, must be cancelled out, which is a very Aristotelian thing as well. So that's the way through which constancy is maintained, produced and maintained. Curiously enough, Antonio Damasio writes, emotions are part and parcel of the regulation we call homeostasis. Whence the paradox that contains the stakes of the entire analysis, maintenance, constancy, inertia, and homeostasis are the paradoxical products of auto-excitation. In order to understand the emotional brain, therefore, we must start from the paradox. So the whole idea of auto-excitation is something which is a product of emotion. So the brain must continue to excite itself automatically, and that excitement must be controlled excitement, not overexcitement, because overexcitement will lead to explosion and then destructive plasticity, as Malabou talks about. So the emotional brain holds the key to contain this paradox, right? The paradox over here is the entire idea of homeostasis must be reliant on autoexcitation. So it sounds like an oxymoron, homeostasis and autoexcitation. But what Malabou is offering is a theory which connects the two conditions. And that's something that even Damasio talks about, the neuroscientist Antonio Damasio. And he says that in order to achieve homeostasis or the stability of emotions, the barest minimal level of emotions, we must be able to produce auto-excitation. The brain must excite itself automatically, because only through auto-excitation and emotion can the brain control itself, right? So this is the emotional brain, and the emotional brain holds the key to this paradox of the connect between auto-excitation and homeostasis. So I'll stop at this point today. So as we can see, Malabou's thesis is quite complex and quite profound, because, as I mentioned, she's one of the very rare philosophers who bridge very serious neuroscientific medical science with philosophical frameworks, and she does it so elegantly and so seamlessly. So as we move on in this book to certain selected passages, as we did today, we see how the bridge is constantly connected and how that can help us in our different kinds of research, medical humanities, trauma studies, and offer a different perspective to trauma studies altogether, a post-Freudian perspective, which is what she offers in a very elegant philosophical framework. So we'll continue with this text in our subsequent sessions. Thank you for your attention.